In October 1873, in the remote hills of western Virginia, construction workers demolishing the abandoned Briarwood Asylum for the spiritually afflicted made a discovery that would haunt the community for generations. Behind a false wall in the asylum's chapel basement, they found the remains of 47 patients, men, women, and children as young as 8 years old, arranged in what investigators would later describe as grotesque tableaus of religious ecstasy. The asylum had operated for 23 years under the direction of Reverend Dr. Josiah Whitmore, treating what the era termed spiritual maladies and moral insanity. Records of the institution's practices had been mysteriously destroyed in a fire just days after Whitmore's death in 1871, leaving only fragments of patient ledgers and administrative documents. These records, sealed by court order for over 150 years, reveal a systematic program of torture disguised as divine treatment that claimed at least 312 documented victims between 1848 and 1871. What made these discoveries particularly disturbing wasn't just the number of bodies or their ritualistic arrangement. Each corpse showed evidence of prolonged suffering, marks of restraint, signs of starvation, and most unnervingly, surgical modifications to their vocal cords. Someone had ensured these victims could not scream. The construction foreman's report, filed with the county sheriff on October 18, 1873, noted that many of the bodies were found with their mouths sewn open in permanent, silent screams, their hands positioned in prayer. But perhaps the most chilling detail emerged when investigators discovered Whitmore's private journal, hidden within a hollowed-out Bible in his former office. The first entry, dated March 3, 1848, began with a single line that would later become infamous in the annals of American crime. "Today I begin God's true work, to create angels from the wretched, even if I must break their earthly vessels to free their souls." How did a man of God transform a sanctuary for the vulnerable into a chamber of horrors? And more disturbing still, why did the local community, including doctors, judges, and sheriffs, continue sending patients to Briarwood even as whispers of strange disappearances and midnight screams began to circulate through the valleys of Appalachia? Before we continue with the dark history of Briarwood Asylum and Reverend Whitmore's descent into madness, if this story intrigues you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We uncover the darkest chapters of American history that others are too afraid to explore. I want to build a community of true mystery seekers here, so tell us in the comments what state or city you're from. Are there any abandoned asylums or hospitals in your area with dark histories? Share your local legends below. You never know which story might be our next investigation. Remember, only the bravest viewers make it through our entire videos. These aren't just stories. They're warnings from history about what happens when we place too much trust in those who claim divine authority. If you're ready to discover the truth about Briarwood Asylum, a truth that local authorities tried to bury for over a century, then steel yourself. What you're about to learn will challenge everything you thought you knew about religious institutions in 19th century America. Let's discover together what really happened behind those asylum walls, and why some secrets are buried so deep that it takes 150 years for them to finally see the light of day. The year 1848 marked a peculiar time in American history, particularly in the isolated valleys of western Virginia. The region surrounding Briarwood, encompassing Willowbrook County and its principal town of Cedar Hollow, existed in a strange twilight between the civilized East and the untamed frontier. With a population of barely 3,200 souls spread across 400 square miles of mountainous terrain, the area remained largely disconnected from the rapid industrialization transforming cities like Richmond and Baltimore. Cedar Hollow itself boasted only 847 residents according to the 1850 census, most of them farmers, timber workers, and tradesmen serving the agricultural community. The town's economy depended entirely on tobacco cultivation, small-scale mining operations, and the lumber trade that floated logs down the Blackwater River each spring. It was a place where everyone knew their neighbor's business, where family names carried weight going back generations, and where the church stood as the absolute center of social and moral authority. Into this insular world came Reverend Dr. Josiah Whitmore in the winter of 1847, bearing credentials that dazzled the provincial community. Here was a man who had studied at Princeton Theological Seminary, who had published treatises on the Christian treatment of mental affliction in respected medical journals, and who came with glowing recommendations from the Presbyterian Synod of Virginia. At 34 years old, Whitmore cut an impressive figure, tall, austere, with penetrating gray eyes, and a voice that could shift from gentle consolation to thunderous sermon with remarkable effect. The town elders, particularly Judge Cornelius Blackwood and Mayor Thomas Ashford, saw in Whitmore the answer to a growing crisis. The state's only public asylum in Williamsburg was overcrowded and hundreds of miles away. Families throughout Western Virginia struggled with relatives suffering from what the era termed lunacy, melancholia, hysteria, and moral insanity. A catch-all diagnosis often applied to unwed mothers, homosexuals, rebellious wives, and anyone else who violated social norms. The isolation of mountain life, combined with poverty, inbreeding in some remote hollows, and the trauma of frontier violence, had created what local doctors called an epidemic of madness. Whitmore's proposal was revolutionary for its time. A private asylum that would combine the latest medical treatments with intensive spiritual rehabilitation. He promised that patients would not merely be warehoused, but restored to both sanity and salvation. The facility would be self-sustaining through patient labor, farming, sewing, carpentry, teaching them valuable skills while funding their treatment. Most appealingly, he offered to accept patients from poor families at reduced rates, subsidized by wealthier patrons from Richmond and Charleston, who would pay premium fees for discreet treatment of embarrassing family members. The location chosen for Briarwood Asylum could not have been more perfect for concealing dark deeds. Situated 7 miles north of Cedar Hollow, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became impassable during spring rains and winter snows, the asylum occupied 200 acres of donated land from the Blackwood estate. The property included a natural depression in the mountains that locals called God's Bowl, a valley surrounded on all sides by steep, forested ridges that muffled sound and blocked views from any direction. The main building, constructed over 18 months using patient labor and local craftsmen, was a formidable 3-story structure of local limestone and timber. Its design reflected Whitmore's philosophy. A central chapel dominated the building, with patient wards extending like wings on either side, men to the east, women to the west. Basement levels, carved into the hillside, housed treatment rooms, storage, and what Whitmore called meditation cells for the most troubled patients. The architecture itself seemed designed to disorient and control, with narrow corridors, minimal windows, and heavy doors that could be barred from the outside. What made discovery of Whitmore's crimes so delayed was the perfect storm of isolation, authority, and social stigma that surrounded mental illness in the 19th century. Families who committed relatives to Briarwood often did so with shame and relief in equal measure. Many patients were essentially abandoned. Their families paid the fees but never visited, preferring to tell neighbors their troubled relatives had gone to live with distant family or simply died. The social death often preceded the physical one. The staff Whitmore assembled appeared on paper to be competent and trustworthy. Dr. Marcus Fleming, formerly of Baltimore, served as medical director. Mrs. Adelaide Marsh, a widow from a respected local family, supervised the female wards. A rotating cast of orderlies, mostly young men from poor mountain families grateful for steady work, maintained order. All were required to sign contracts that included strict confidentiality clauses and prohibitions against discussing asylum business with outsiders. Standard practice for the era, but particularly useful for maintaining secrecy. Local authorities had every reason to support Whitmore's work. Sheriff Ezra Dawson found it convenient to have somewhere to deposit vagrants, drunks, and anyone else who disturbed the peace. Judge Blackwood, whose own daughter suffered from nervous exhaustion after a scandalous affair, became one of the asylum's most vocal supporters and financial backers. The town's only newspaper, the Cedar Hollow Gazette, run by Whitmore's fellow Presbyterian Elder Samuel Cox, published glowing reports of the asylum's humanitarian work and miraculous cures. By 1850, Briarwood Asylum had become a point of pride for Cedar Hollow. Delegations from other counties toured the facilities, carefully guided tour that showed only the chapel, the sunny day room, and the well-maintained gardens. Whitmore presented papers at medical conferences in Richmond, becoming recognized as a leading authority on the intersection of spiritual and mental health. The asylum's annual reports, filed with the state, showed steadily improving cure rates and detailed financial accounts that satisfied bureaucrats in the capital. No one questioned why the asylum's cemetery grew so rapidly, or why so many patients were listed as transferred to state care, when no records of such transfers existed at other institutions. No one investigated why local suppliers delivered far less food than an institution housing 80 to 100 patients would require. And no one, absolutely no one, wondered why the screams that occasionally echoed from God's bowl always seemed to stop so abruptly, as if cut off mid-cry. To understand how Josiah Whitmore operated with impunity for 23 years, one must first comprehend the elaborate facade he constructed, a performance so convincing that even those who witnessed troubling signs explained them away rather than confront the horrifying truth. Whitmore had crafted not just a false identity but an entire theatrical production, with the asylum as his stage and the community as his unwitting audience. Every Sunday, Whitmore descended from Briarwood to preach at Cedar Hollow Presbyterian Church, where his sermons drew crowds from 3 counties. He spoke with extraordinary eloquence about redemption, divine mercy, and the Christian duty to care for society's most vulnerable. His sermon on The Least of These, delivered on Easter Sunday 1851, was reprinted in newspapers across Virginia. In it, he compared his work at Briarwood to Christ's healing of the demon-possessed, declaring that madness is but the devil's chain upon the soul, and through prayer, patience, and proper medical treatment, we can break those chains and restore God's children to his light. The Reverend's public persona was meticulously cultivated. He dressed in expensive but austere clothing, black wool suits of finest quality but conservative cut. He carried a medical bag alongside his Bible, symbolizing the dual nature of his ministry. His manner was grave but compassionate, and he had a remarkable ability to remember names, faces, and family details of everyone he met. When little Martha Henderson broke her arm falling from a tree, Whitmore was there within hours, setting the bone with professional skill and refusing payment. When the Potomac flooded in 1852, washing away 3 families' homes, Whitmore organized relief efforts and housed the displaced in Briarwood's outbuildings. The asylum's public face was equally deceiving. Whitmore instituted monthly, visiting Sundays when carefully selected patients, those still capable of coherent speech and controlled behavior, would receive family members in the chapel and day room. These patients, unknown to visitors, received extra food and mild sedatives beforehand to ensure docile, pleasant demeanors. Mrs. Charlotte Pemberton, whose husband had committed her for hysteria after she accused him of adultery, became Whitmore's star patient. She would sit at the piano during visits, playing hymns with mechanical precision, her eyes glazed but her fingers remembering the notes. Visitors marveled at her improvement, not knowing that Whitmore had subjected her to ice water treatments and forced isolation until she learned to perform exactly as required. Dr. Marcus Fleming, the medical director, genuinely believed in Whitmore's methods at first. A morphine addict himself following a war injury, Fleming spent most days in an opium haze, signing whatever documents Whitmore placed before him. On his few lucid days, when he questioned the high mortality rates or the screams from the basement, Whitmore would explain that spiritual healing often requires the patient to confront their demons directly, and such confrontations are naturally distressing. He would then adjust Fleming's morphine dosage, ensuring the doctor remained comfortably numb to reality. The warning signs were numerous but systematically explained away. When farmhand Joseph Turner reported seeing patients digging graves at night by torchlight, Whitmore explained it as therapeutic labor, designed to help patients confront mortality and appreciate life. When Mrs. Abigail Foster, visiting her sister, noticed old blood stains on the chapel floor, Whitmore claimed they were from patients who self-harmed during fits of religious ecstasy, and launched into a learned discourse on medieval saints and mortification of the flesh. Perhaps most telling were the supplies ordered by the asylum. Benjamin Hartwell, who owned Cedar Hollow's general store, kept meticulous records that would later prove damning. The asylum ordered enormous quantities of restraint equipment, leather straps, chains, padlocks, which Whitmore explained were necessary for the safety of violent patients during therapeutic sessions. They purchased industrial quantities of lye, supposedly for cleaning and laundry. They bought surgical instruments that seemed excessive for basic medical care, justified as necessary for emergency procedures when the nearest surgeon is a day's ride away. Sheriff Ezra Dawson, one of Whitmore's key unwitting enablers, brought the Reverend a steady stream of victims under the guise of maintaining public order. Vagrants, prostitutes, anyone who couldn't afford bail, they would be declared mentally incompetent by Dr. Fleming and remanded to Briarwood for treatment. Dawson genuinely believed he was being merciful. Better the asylum than the harsh conditions of the county jail. He would later testify with evident anguish that he had delivered lambs to the wolf's den, thinking it a shepherd's care. The most elaborate deception involved the asylum's financial records. Whitmore maintained 3 sets of books, one for the state inspectors showing modest operations and reasonable expenses, one for the Board of Trustees showing profitable management that justified their continued investment, and one true ledger hidden in his private study that detailed the actual fate of patients and the disposal of their possessions. Patients who died of natural causes often had their deaths recorded months or even years after the fact, during which time their families continued paying for care. Some patients were listed as discharged or transferred, while their families received forged letters about their continued treatment elsewhere. The inspection visits, required annually by state law, were choreographed productions. Inspector James Worthington's 1856 report praised Briarwood as a model institution where Christian charity and modern medicine work hand in hand. He toured the same carefully prepared areas, met the same coached patients, and reviewed the same falsified documents that had fooled his predecessors. Whitmore would escort him personally, steering conversations away from any troubling topics with practiced ease. The inspector's report specifically noted the remarkable quietness and order of the institution, not realizing this silence was achieved through surgical mutilation of vocal cords. Local physician Dr. Henry Barrett grew suspicious in 1858 when he noticed that none of his referred patients ever seemed to leave Briarwood. They either died there or were transferred. When he raised concerns with Judge Blackwood, he was reminded that questioning a man of Whitmore's standing without proof would be socially and professionally catastrophic. Barrett was subtly threatened with the loss of his medical practice if he persisted in making baseless accusations against a pillar of our community. The families of patients, desperate and often ashamed, became accomplices in their own deception. They wanted to believe their loved ones were being helped. When patients' letters home stopped coming, Whitmore explained that isolation from family was often necessary for treatment. When patients died, families were told it was due to their pre-existing conditions, never questioning why they weren't allowed to view the bodies before burial. The shame of mental illness was so profound that many families were secretly relieved when their problematic relatives disappeared into Briarwood, never to emerge. Even the architecture of deception was carefully planned. The asylum's public entrance led through beautiful gardens and into a welcoming reception area with paintings of pastoral scenes and comfortable furniture. The patient wards visible from this area appeared clean and orderly. But behind locked doors, access through a maze of corridors that only staff could navigate, lay the true Briarwood. The isolation cells, the treatment rooms, and the chapel basement where Whitmore conducted his most horrific experiments in creating what he called angels of silence. The unraveling of Whitmore's carefully constructed facade began not with a dramatic revelation, but with a series of seemingly unconnected incidents that, like drops of blood seeping through pristine white cloth, gradually revealed the horror beneath. The first significant crack appeared in September 1869, when Thomas Garrett, a timber cutter working the forests near Briarwood, became lost during an early autumn storm. Seeking shelter, he stumbled upon a shallow ravine a half-mile from the asylum grounds. There, partially exposed by heavy rains, he discovered what he initially thought were discarded medical training dolls. It was only when he grabbed what he thought was a pale stick to steady himself that he realized he was holding a human femur. Garrett reported his discovery to Sheriff Dawson, who accompanied him back to the site with 2 deputies. They uncovered the remains of at least 11 bodies, hastily buried without coffins or markers. The corpses were in various states of decomposition, but what disturbed the sheriff most were the evident signs of violence: crushed skulls, broken ribs, and most unnervingly, several bodies were missing their tongues. Dawson, still believing in Whitmore's integrity, initially accepted the Reverend's explanation that these were indigent patients who had died during a typhoid outbreak in 1867, buried quickly to prevent contagion. The missing tongues, self-mutilation during fevered delusions, Whitmore explained smoothly. A tragic but not uncommon symptom of advanced brain fever. But doubt had been planted in Dawson's mind, a seed that would grow over the following months. The second incident occurred on Christmas Eve, 1869. Margaret O'Brien, a new Irish immigrant working as a laundress at the asylum, fled the institution in the middle of the night, arriving at the Catholic Church in Cedar Hollow bloodied and hysterical. Father Francisco Mendez, the parish priest, took her confession in a mixture of broken English and Gaelic. What she told him was so horrific that he initially believed she was suffering from delusions. Margaret claimed to have been cleaning the chapel late one evening when she heard singing from below. Not hymns, but something else, something that sounded like Latin mixed with words she didn't recognize. Curious, she had found a door hidden behind the altar and descended into the basement. There, she witnessed Whitmore and three orderlies arranged around a table where a young woman lay strapped down, her mouth held open by metal devices. Whitmore was reading from a black book while one of the orderlies appeared to be cutting something from the woman's throat. The woman's eyes were open, alive, moving frantically, but no sound emerged from her mouth except a wet, gasping wheeze. Margaret had fled immediately, but was certain she'd been seen. She showed Father Mendez bruises on her arms where someone had grabbed her as she ran through the asylum corridors, and a deep cut on her shoulder she claimed came from an orderly's knife as she escaped through a window. Father Mendez, despite his theological differences with Whitmore, struggled to believe such accusations against a fellow man of God. However, he documented Margaret's testimony and sent her to stay with a Catholic family in Richmond for her safety. His letter to Bishop Hughes in Baltimore, dated December 26, 1869, would later become crucial evidence. In it, he wrote, "I fear there is something deeply wrong at Briarwood, something that wears the mask of Christianity while serving a far darker master. The pattern that would finally expose Whitmore began to emerge in the mind of Dr. Samuel Morrison, a young physician who had recently arrived in Cedar Hollow to take over old Dr. Barrett's practice after the latter's sudden death from heart failure. Morrison, educated at Harvard Medical School and influenced by emerging scientific approaches to medicine, brought a skeptical eye that the insular community had previously lacked. Morrison first noticed irregularities when reviewing death certificates filed by Briarwood. The causes of death were suspiciously vague: nervous exhaustion, spiritual crisis, divine translation, terms that had no medical meaning. More troubling was the pattern. Deaths peaked during new moons, when the nights were darkest. Young women between ages 16 and 25 had a mortality rate 3 times higher than any other demographic. And most suspicious of all, not a single patient had been recorded as cured and released in the past 5 years. When Morrison raised these concerns with the medical board in Richmond, he received an unexpected visit from Judge Blackwood and 2 large men the judge introduced as concerned citizens. They strongly suggested that a young doctor new to the community should focus on building his practice rather than making enemies of established institutions. Morrison's cat was found dead on his doorstep the next morning, its vocal cords cut out. But Morrison was not easily intimidated. He began quietly collecting information, interviewing former asylum employees who had left under mysterious circumstances. What he learned painted an increasingly horrific picture. Guards spoke in whispers of the Angel Room in the basement where patients were taken but never returned. A former cook revealed that she was instructed to prepare special meals for certain patients, meals that always included a bitter tea that left them docile and confused. A gardener admitted to digging far more graves than there were official deaths, always at night, always in the presence of Whitmore himself, who would read passages from a book that wasn't the Bible. The breaking point came in March 1870. Sarah Ashford, the 15-year-old daughter of Mayor Thomas Ashford, was committed to Briarwood for hysteria after she was found in a compromising position with a traveling salesman. Her parents, seeking to avoid scandal, trusted Whitmore to cure their daughter's moral weakness and restore her virtue. 2 weeks later, they received word that Sarah had suffered a complete breakdown and could receive no visitors for at least 6 months. Morrison, who had been treating Sarah for minor ailments since childhood, knew something was wrong. The girl was spirited and rebellious, yes, but not hysterical or insane. Using his medical authority, he demanded to examine her, claiming concern about a potential tuberculosis outbreak. Whitmore resisted, but with Morrison threatening to involve state health authorities, he finally relented, but only allowed a brief, supervised visit. What Morrison found in that visit haunted him for the rest of his life. Sarah sat in a clean, well-lit room, dressed in a pristine white gown. She appeared calm, even serene. But when Morrison approached, he noticed her lips moving constantly in silent prayer. When he asked her to speak, she opened her mouth wide, and he saw the horror. Her tongue had been partially severed, leaving only enough for her to swallow but not enough to form words. Scars on her throat suggested repeated surgeries. Her eyes, when they met his, held a terror so profound that Morrison later wrote it was, "As if I was looking into hell itself." Whitmore, standing beside him, explained calmly that Sarah had injured herself during a violent episode, biting her own tongue nearly off. The throat scars were from emergency surgery to save her life. "She is at peace now," Whitmore said, "no longer able to speak the blasphemies that once possessed her. She can only pray, which is all any of us truly need." Morrison left the asylum that day knowing he had to act, but also knowing that direct confrontation would likely result in his own death or disappearance. Instead, he began a correspondence with colleagues in Richmond and Washington, building a case that would require outside intervention. His letters, written in medical Latin to avoid local postal inspection, described what he suspected was happening at Briarwood. Systematic mutilation disguised as treatment, murder disguised as natural death, and all of it wrapped in a perverse religious ideology that Whitmore had either created or discovered in some ancient, forbidden text. The final incident that would trigger the investigation occurred on April 15, 1870, Good Friday. A patient named William Henley, a former seminary student committed for religious mania, managed to escape during chapel services. He was found 3 days later in the woods, dead from exposure and blood loss. But before he died, he was discovered by a hunting party who heard his weakened cries. Unable to speak, his vocal cords had been severed like the others. He had used his own blood to write a message on a flat rock. He makesangels for God, he cuts out our sins. The basement is hell. Warn THEM. The hunting party included Judge Blackwood's own son, Theodore, recently returned from university in Philadelphia. Unlike his father, Theodore had been exposed to modern ideas and was less willing to accept explanations that defied logic. He preserved the bloody rock and William Henley's body, refusing to release them to Whitmore for burial. He also discovered something clutched in Henley's dead hand, a page torn from what appeared to be a very old book, written in Latin with disturbing marginalia in Whitmore's handwriting. The page described a ritual called Silentium Angelorum, the silence of angels, which promised to purify souls through the removal of the lying tongue and the creation of perpetual prayer. Theodore Blackwood's decision to contact federal authorities rather than local law enforcement would prove crucial. His telegram to the U.S. Attorney in Richmond on April 20, 1870, read simply, "Multiple murders at Briarwood Asylum. Local authorities compromised. Federal intervention required immediately. Evidence secured. Come at once. If this is giving you chills, you're not alone. What we've uncovered so far about Briarwood Asylum is just the beginning, the surface layer of a horror that goes deeper than you can possibly imagine. The systematic silencing of patients, the surgical removal of tongues, the transformation of human beings into what Whitmore called his angels. All of this was just preparation for something even more sinister. Before we reveal what federal investigators found in that basement, please take a moment to share this video. These stories need to be heard. For over 150 years, the victims of Briarwood have been silenced twice, first by Whitmore's blade, and then by a society that wanted to forget. By sharing their story, you give them back their voice. Hit that like button if you want us to continue uncovering America's darkest historical secrets. And remember, we're building a community of truth seekers here. Let's discover together what happens next, because I promise you, what the federal agents found when they finally entered that chapel basement will challenge everything you thought you knew about religious extremism in American history. The real nightmare at Briarwood wasn't just what Whitmore did to his patients. It was why he did it, and who was helping him, Federal Marshal Harrison Blake and U.S. Attorney Jonathan Crawford arrived in Cedar Hollow on April 24, 1870, accompanied by 6 armed deputies and Dr. Lawrence Ashby, a forensic specialist from Washington who had studied under pioneering criminologist Alphonse Bertillon in Paris. What they discovered over the next 3 weeks would constitute one of the most extensive criminal investigations of the 19th century, ultimately filling 47 volumes of evidence that would remain sealed by court order until our present day. The initial entry to Briarwood on April 25th met with resistance. Whitmore, maintaining his composure, insisted on seeing warrants and threatened legal action for trespass. It was only when Marshal Blake placed him under arrest for federal mail fraud. Morrison's intercepted letters had provided evidence of fraudulent billing across state lines, that they gained full access to the facility. Whitmore's calm demeanor never cracked. He simply requested his Bible and informed the officers that God's work cannot be stopped by earthly authority. What the investigators found in the main wards was disturbing enough. Of the 73 patients officially listed as current residents, they located only 41. The others, Whitmore claimed, had been released to family or transferred, though no documentation existed for these departures. The surviving patients were found in various states of mutilation and psychological destruction. 38 of the 41 had undergone some form of surgical modification to their vocal cords. The 3 who could still speak were recent arrivals, scheduled for treatment the following week. Dr. Ashby's medical examination of the survivors revealed a consistent pattern of surgical intervention. The procedures, while crude by modern standards, showed considerable anatomical knowledge. Incisions were precise, avoiding major blood vessels while systematically destroying the vocal apparatus. Some patients had undergone multiple surgeries, suggesting Whitmore had refined his technique over time. The oldest survivor, Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, bore scars indicating at least 7 separate operations over a period of 3 years. But it was the basement that revealed the true scope of Whitmore's madness. The entrance, hidden behind the chapel's altar, descended into a network of rooms carved from the limestone bedrock. The first chamber, which Whitmore had called the preparation room, contained surgical equipment that Dr. Ashby identified as consistent with both contemporary medical practice and medieval torture devices. Leather restraints showed blood stains and wear patterns indicating hundreds of uses. The walls were lined with anatomical drawings, specifically detailed illustrations of the human throat and tongue, annotated in Whitmore's precise handwriting with notes like "First incision here to preserve swallowing," and "Avoid this nerve to maintain breathing reflex." The second chamber, larger than the first, was the angel room that former employees had whispered about. Here, investigators found 17 bodies in various states of preservation, arranged in a grotesque parody of a heavenly choir. Each corpse was positioned upright, held in place by iron frameworks that kept them standing with arms raised in supplication. Their mouths were propped open with metal devices, and their preserved bodies showed evidence of chemical treatment. Whitmore had been experimenting with embalming techniques to maintain his angels in a state of perpetual worship. The bodies ranged in age from approximately 8 to 60 years old. Each wore a white robe with a number embroidered on the chest. A ledger found in the room matched these numbers to names, dates of transformation, and disturbing notes about each subject's sins that had been removed. Young Mary Patterson, age 12, had been purified of lying. Mrs. Catherine Wells, age 34, had been cleansed of adultery. Mr. James Crawford, age 19, had been freed from sodomy. The third chamber contained what can only be described as a library of madness. Hundreds of journals, filled with Whitmore's meticulous records, documented every aspect of his 23-year experiment. The earliest entries revealed his initial inspiration, a text he claimed to have discovered in 1847 while researching at a private library in Boston. This book, which he referred to as Liber Silentium Sanctum, the Book of Sacred Silence, was allegedly a medieval manuscript describing how certain monks had created living prayers by removing the human capacity for speech while maintaining the ability to worship. Whitmore's journals traced his evolution from a man who genuinely believed he was serving God to something far more sinister. Early entries showed doubt and remorse. The girl cried so terribly before the procedure. I pray God forgives me if I am wrong. But by 1855, his tone had changed completely. Removed the tongue entirely today rather than partial severance. The subject's eyes showed beautiful terror. Surely this is the fear of God made manifest. They cannot speak lies, cannot blaspheme, cannot sin with their words. They are closer to angels than humans now. The systematic nature of his approach became clear through his categorization system. Patients were divided into groups based on their sins and treated accordingly. Liars had their tongues removed entirely. Blasphemers underwent additional procedures to their larynx. Sexual deviants faced the most extensive modifications, often including castration or other genital mutilation alongside the vocal cord surgery. Women who had been committed for hysteria, often simply meaning they had challenged male authority, underwent procedures Whitmore called purification of the feminine voice, which involved not just vocal cord damage, but removal of parts of the throat that he believed produced seductive tones. Financial records found in a hidden safe revealed another layer of horror. Whitmore had been selling bodies to medical colleges throughout the eastern seaboard, listing them as unclaimed indigents. But he wasn't just selling corpses. He was providing living subjects for anatomical study. Letters from physicians in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York thanked him for providing specimens in excellent condition for vivisection demonstrations. One letter from a Dr. Marcus Heller of Columbia Medical College specifically praised the unique preparations of the vocal apparatus that had advanced our understanding of human speech mechanisms considerably. The investigation uncovered a network of complicity that extended far beyond Cedar Hollow. Judge Blackwood, when confronted with evidence of his knowledge of the crimes, committed suicide before he could be arrested, leaving behind a confession that revealed he had been blackmailed by Whitmore after the Reverend had treated his daughter for an unwanted pregnancy, a treatment that had resulted in her death. Sheriff Dawson, broken by the revelation of his unwitting role in delivering victims, provided extensive testimony about how Whitmore had manipulated local authorities. Perhaps most disturbing were the records of Whitmore's special projects. Beginning in 1862, he had begun experimenting with creating what he called cherubim, children specifically raised from infancy to be pure vessels of worship. These children, obtained through various means including purchasing from desperate families and kidnapping orphans, were subjected to vocal cord surgery before they could learn to speak. His goal was to create beings who had never known the sin of speech and could only communicate through what he interpreted as divine glossolalia, incomprehensible sounds he believed were the language of angels. 7 of these cherubim were found alive in a hidden nursery behind the main basement. Aged between 2 and 9 years old, none could speak, and all showed signs of severe psychological trauma. Dr. Ashby's report noted that they had been conditioned to respond to certain biblical passages with specific movements and sounds, creating a grotesque pantomime of worship. They showed extreme fear responses to any attempt at verbal communication, having been brutally punished for attempting to develop speech. The investigation also revealed that Whitmore had not acted entirely alone. 3 orderlies, brothers Samuel, Isaac, and Matthew Crane, had been his most devoted assistants, participating actively in the surgeries and murders. When arrested, they showed no remorse, with Samuel stating that they had been doing the Lord's work and that the Reverend had shown them the true path to paradise. Their testimony revealed that Whitmore had conducted regular services in the basement where the modified patients were forced to participate in blasphemous rituals that combined Christian liturgy with elements that Dr. Crawford, who had studied comparative religion, identified as pre-Christian Germanic paganism and possible Gnostic influences. A hidden room discovered on May 8th contained what investigators believed to be Whitmore's ultimate project. Dubbed the Throne Room, it contained a single chair constructed from human bones, primarily femurs and skulls, facing an altar made from preserved human tongues. Above the altar hung a tapestry woven from human hair, depicting what appeared to be angels bowing before a figure that resembled Whitmore himself. On the altar lay an incomplete manuscript, Whitmore's attempt to create his own scripture, the Gospel of Silence, which proclaimed that God's greatest gift to humanity was not speech, but the ability to have it removed, that true worship could only come from those incapable of lies, and that he, Whitmore, was the prophet of the mute God. The final death toll, as best as investigators could determine, was staggering. Based on burial records, bone fragments found in the asylum's furnace, and bodies discovered in various locations around the property. At least 312 people had died at Briarwood between 1848 and 1870. This number did not include those who had survived but been released to families, who then institutionalized them elsewhere, or those who had died after leaving the asylum from complications of their treatment. Dr. Morrison, who assisted in the investigation, discovered that Whitmore had been testing various chemical compounds on patients, documenting their effects with scientific precision. These substances, derived from local plants and minerals, included paralytic agents, hallucinogens, and compounds that caused permanent neurological damage. Many patients who appeared calm and docile had actually been chemically lobotomized, their minds destroyed while their bodies remained functional enough to perform simple tasks and maintain the asylum's appearance of normality. The true horror of Briarwood wasn't just in the number of victims or the grotesque nature of their deaths and mutilations. It was in the systematic, methodical approach Whitmore had taken to his madness. Every surgery was documented. Every death was categorized. Every experiment was recorded with scientific detachment. He had created an entire theological and philosophical framework to justify his actions, complete with carefully reasoned arguments and biblical citations taken out of context. In his mind, he wasn't a murderer. He was a pioneer, transforming flawed humanity into perfect worshipers, one severed tongue at a time. As federal investigators delved deeper into the Briarwood conspiracy, they uncovered a web of complicity that extended far beyond rural Virginia, reaching into the highest echelons of American medical, religious, and political establishments. What had initially appeared to be the isolated madness of one man gradually revealed itself as part of a larger, more terrifying pattern that threatened to implicate dozens of prominent figures across the eastern seaboard. The breakthrough came when Dr. Ashby decoded a cipher hidden within Whitmore's financial ledgers. Using a substitution code based on biblical verse numbers, Whitmore had maintained correspondence with a network he referred to as the Silent Brotherhood, a secret society of medical professionals, clergymen, and asylum directors who shared his belief in surgical modification as a path to spiritual purity. The decoded messages revealed monthly meetings in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Boston, where members exchanged techniques, shared specimens, and planned the expansion of their practices. Marshall Blake's team, following these leads, discovered that Briarwood was not unique, but rather one of 7 similar institutions operating across 5 states. The Blessed Rest Sanitarium in Pennsylvania, the Holy Suffering House in Maryland, the Redemption Home in Massachusetts, and 3 others had all been implementing variations of Whitmore's methods. Conservative estimates suggested that over 2,000 victims had been subjected to these procedures across all facilities over a 25-year period. The resistance to the investigation intensified dramatically once its scope became apparent. On May 15, 1870, Marshall Blake's hotel room in Richmond was set ablaze while he slept, and only the quick action of his deputies saved his life. Dr. Morrison received a package containing his sister's severed finger and a note warning that she would lose more than that if he continued assisting the investigation. U.S. Attorney Crawford's wife was approached by men who suggested she convince her husband to focus on less controversial matters if she valued their children's safety. The most shocking revelation came when investigators arrested Dr. Marcus Heller of Columbia Medical College. Under interrogation, Heller revealed that the practice of purchasing modified patients from Whitmore and others had been an open secret in certain medical circles. These living subjects, unable to scream or protest, had been used in vivisection demonstrations, live dissections performed before medical students. Heller's confession implicated professors at Harvard, Yale, and Johns Hopkins, though most would never face prosecution due to lack of direct evidence and the influence they wielded. The investigation took an even darker turn when Theodore Blackwood, before his father's suicide, had provided investigators with a collection of documents hidden in the family estate. Among these papers was correspondence dating back to 1823 between Judge Blackwood's father and a European organization called Ordo Silente Aeterni, Order of Eternal Silence. This group, apparently founded in medieval Germany, promoted the belief that human speech was the source of all sin, and that creating mute servants of God was a sacred duty. The European connection led investigators to uncover Whitmore's true past. The man claiming to be Josiah Whitmore had actually been born Wilhelm Weissmann in Bavaria in 1813. He had fled Europe in 1845 after being implicated in the disappearance of numerous patients from an asylum in Munich. Ship records showed he had arrived in Boston in 1846, reinvented himself as a Presbyterian minister with forged credentials, and spent a year studying at the Boston Athenaeum, where he had discovered the American branch of the order. Further investigation revealed that the order had been placing its members in positions of authority throughout American institutions for decades. Dr. Ashby's research uncovered at least 15 asylum directors, 7 medical college professors, and numerous religious leaders who showed connections to the organization. They had been careful, never acting in concert publicly, but privately sharing knowledge, protecting each other from investigation, and gradually normalizing extreme treatments for mental illness that provided cover for their true activities. The discovery of a second site in Virginia proved particularly horrifying. Following information extracted from Samuel Crane, investigators located an abandoned mine shaft 12 miles from Briarwood that had been converted into what Whitmore's journals called the failing chamber. Here, those who had resisted the initial procedures, or who had somehow maintained their ability to vocalize, were subjected to more extreme experiments. The investigators found evidence of attempts to surgically alter brain tissue, primitive lobotomies performed without anesthesia, and something Whitmore had called spiritual vivisection, the systematic dismantling of a living person while forcing them to watch in mirrors, based on the belief that witnessing one's own disassembly would separate the soul from the body. The mine shaft contained the remains of at least 60 individuals, though the advanced decomposition and evidence of quicklime use made exact numbers impossible to determine. More disturbing were the 17 survivors found in a natural cave system deeper, in the mine patients who had been abandoned, when Whitmore realized the investigation was closing in. These individuals had been left in complete darkness for weeks, surviving on rainwater and cannibalism. Only 3 retained enough sanity to provide testimony, and their accounts of what had transpired in the darkness would haunt the investigators for years. The political implications of the investigation created a crisis that reached Washington. When it was discovered that Senator Marcus Fillmore of Maryland was a member of the Silent Brotherhood and had directed federal funds to several of the implicated institutions, President Grant himself had to intervene to prevent the investigation from being shut down. 3 federal judges recused themselves from the case when connections to the order were uncovered. The Attorney General received daily pressure from wealthy families whose relatives had been involved, offering bribes and threats in equal measure. Dr. Morrison's continued investigation revealed that Whitmore had been experimenting with more than just surgical silencing. He had been attempting to create what he called perfect vessels, human beings modified not just vocally, but neurologically to exist in a state of perpetual religious ecstasy. Using a combination of surgical intervention, chemical treatments, and psychological conditioning, he had been trying to create humans who existed only to worship, incapable of any thought or action beyond prayer and praise. The records showed that 12 such attempts had been made, all failures resulting in death, but Whitmore's notes indicated he was close to success. His final journal entry, dated April 14, 1870, the day before William Henley's escape, stated, "Tomorrow, with subject number 13, I shall finally create a true angel on earth. The formula is perfected, the procedure refined. God will have his perfect worshiper, and I will have proven that humanity can be transformed into divinity through sufficient faith and the knife." The investigation also uncovered financial corruption on a massive scale. The Silent Brotherhood had been embezzling funds from the estates of committed patients, murdering wealthy individuals who had been institutionalized and forging documents to inherit their property. They had accumulated wealth exceeding $2 million, hidden in accounts across multiple banks under false names. This money had been used to bribe officials, fund the construction of new facilities, and import rare texts and surgical equipment from Europe. One of the most chilling discoveries was a map found in Whitmore's study showing planned locations for 23 new facilities across the United States and territories. Each site was marked with projected conversion numbers and notes about local authorities who could be corrupted or replaced. The Brotherhood had been planning a massive expansion, anticipating that within a decade they could be processing thousands of patients annually. The international scope became clear when investigators intercepted correspondence with similar organizations in England, France, and Germany. The movement was not limited to America, but was part of a worldwide network of individuals who believed that humanity needed to be purified through surgical and chemical intervention. References were found to facilities in India, where British colonial authorities had allegedly allowed experiments on local populations, and to South American locations where indigenous peoples had been subjected to these procedures under the guise of missionary work. As the investigation progressed, more survivors came forward. Former employees who had fled Briarwood and similar institutions began to testify, protected by federal marshals from retaliation. Their accounts painted a picture of systematic indoctrination, where staff were gradually introduced to more extreme practices and either became complicit or disappeared. Several testified that they had been told they were part of a great work that would transform humanity and bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth. The medical establishment's complicity ran deeper than initially suspected. Investigation of medical supply companies revealed that certain businesses had been specifically created to provide instruments and chemicals to the Brotherhood's facilities. These companies had developed specialized tools for vocal cord surgery, restraint systems designed for long-term immobilization, and chemical compounds specifically formulated to damage neurological function while keeping patients alive. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that some prominent families had knowingly sent relatives to these facilities not for treatment, but for elimination. Embarrassing family members, wives who knew too much, children who might contest inheritances. They had been deliberately placed in Whitmore's and others' hands with full knowledge of what would happen. Payment records showed premium fees for complete resolution of family problems. By June 1870, the investigation had identified over 200 individuals directly involved in the conspiracy and hundreds more who had knowledge of the crimes but had remained silent. The scope was so vast that Attorney Crawford wrote to President Grant, "We are not dealing with a criminal conspiracy, but with a shadow government that has operated within our nation for decades, murdering citizens under the protection of medical and religious authority. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the systematic mutilations, the underground network of killers masquerading as healers, the international conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of society. The investigation was about to reveal something that would shake the very foundations of American justice. What you're about to learn in the next section is why this story was buried for 150 years, why powerful families paid fortunes to keep these records sealed, and why even today there are those who don't want you to know what really happened when Whitmore and his followers finally faced justice, or didn't. Please share this video before it's too late. Every view, every share, every comment helps ensure these victims are not forgotten again. We're not just telling a story here. We're part of a true crime family that refuses to let the powerful bury their sins. The reckoning that followed the Briarwood investigation would test whether America truly believed in justice for all, or if wealth, influence, and religious authority could still shield monsters from the consequences of their actions. What happened in those courtrooms would set precedents that echo to this day. Are you ready for the truth about how this ended? Because I warn you, justice in 1870 looked very different from what we might expect today. The trial of Josiah Whitmore and his accomplices began on September 5, 1870, in Richmond's Federal Circuit Court, presided over by Judge Artemus Hancock, specially appointed by President Grant after 3 other judges had recused themselves. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney Jonathan Crawford with assistance from a team of federal prosecutors brought in from Washington, faced immediate challenges that would define the entire proceedings. The first obstacle was jurisdictional. Defense attorneys argued that crimes committed within a private asylum fell under state, not federal, authority. It was only through the mail fraud charges, the interstate billing and correspondence, that federal jurisdiction was established. This technicality would prove crucial, as Virginia state law at the time provided numerous loopholes for crimes committed in the course of medical treatment, and granted broad immunity to religious figures acting within their spiritual authority. Whitmore himself presented an unsettling figure in court. Clean-shaven, dressed in his ministerial collar, he maintained an aura of calm righteousness that disturbed even veteran court observers. When asked to enter his plea, he stated, "I do not recognize the authority of this earthly court over God's work. I have committed no crimes, only carried out divine mandates that your limited understanding cannot comprehend." His attorney quickly entered a not guilty plea on his behalf, but the damage to public perception was done. Newspapers across the country painted him as either a madman or a monster. The selection of a jury proved nearly impossible. Most potential jurors from the Richmond area had either connections to the implicated institutions or expressed fears for their safety if they served. Eventually, jurors were brought in from Western territories, men who had no connections to Eastern establishment, but whose lack of education made them susceptible to manipulation by skilled defense attorneys. The defense team, funded by mysterious benefactors whose identities were protected by attorney-client privilege, included some of the nation's most prominent lawyers. The prosecution's case seemed overwhelming. They presented 847 pieces of physical evidence, including preserved bodies, surgical instruments, and Whitmore's extensive documentation of his crimes. Survivors testified, though many had to write their testimonies due to their mutilations. Dr. Morrison provided expert medical testimony about the procedures performed, while Dr. Ashby presented the forensic evidence in excruciating detail. Yet the defense proved formidably creative in their arguments. They claimed Whitmore suffered from religious mania and was therefore not responsible for his actions. They argued that patients had consented to treatment, even if they hadn't understood what that treatment entailed. Most audaciously, they suggested that the surgical procedures, while extreme, were within the bounds of contemporary medical practice. Hadn't Dr. Benjamin Rush, founding father and physician, advocated for similarly aggressive treatments for mental illness? The trial took a shocking turn when 3 key witnesses died under mysterious circumstances. Margaret O'Brien, the Irish laundress whose testimony had been crucial, was found dead in her Richmond boarding house, apparently from poisoning. Dr. Marcus Fleming died in his cell of an apparent morphine overdose, though he had been searched and no drugs were found. Most disturbing was the death of Sarah Ashford, the mayor's daughter, who somehow managed to hang herself despite having no use of her arms due to restraints and constant guard supervision. These deaths created an atmosphere of terror. Other witnesses recanted or modified their testimony. Guards reported being approached with bribes or threats. Judge Hancock himself received a package containing a human tongue and a note reading, "Silence is golden." Federal marshals had to be stationed around the courthouse, and the trial was briefly suspended after a bomb threat was received. The involvement of prominent figures created a separate crisis. When evidence implicated Senator Fillmore, Congress quickly passed a resolution granting him immunity in exchange for testimony he never actually provided. Medical professors named in the investigation retained powerful lawyers who filed injunctions preventing their names from being mentioned in court. Religious leaders mobilized their congregations to protest the persecution of men of God. with thousands gathering outside the courthouse daily. The verdict, when it came on November 15, 1870, was a mixed victory for justice. Whitmore was found guilty of murder, mail fraud, and conspiracy, sentenced to death by hanging. The Crane brothers were similarly convicted and sentenced to death. However, of the 43 others indicted, only 12 were convicted, mostly of lesser charges. The rest were acquitted due to insufficient evidence or had their charges dropped when witnesses became unavailable. Even these convictions proved hollow. Whitmore's execution, scheduled for January 1, 1871, never occurred. On December 15, 1870, he was found dead in his cell, apparently from self-administered poison, though no poison was ever found and the guards on duty could not explain how he obtained it. His body was quickly cremated on orders from prison officials, preventing any autopsy. The Crane brothers met similar fates. Samuel died of sudden illness, Isaac in a prison fire, and Matthew during an alleged escape attempt where his body was never recovered. The societal impact of the Briarwood revelations was significant but limited. Virginia passed the Asylum Reform Act of 1871, requiring regular state inspections and prohibiting certain surgical procedures without patient consent. However, the definition of consent remained vague and inspections were chronically underfunded. Other states passed similar legislation with similar weaknesses, creating an appearance of reform without substantial change. The fate of survivors was largely tragic. Of the 41 patients found alive at Briarwood, only 17 lived more than a year after their rescue. Many died from complications of their injuries or suicide. Those who survived faced a society that had no place for them, mutilated, traumatized, often unable to communicate. The state provided minimal support, and most ended up in other institutions where they were hidden away, embarrassments to a system that had failed them. The 7 cherubim children presented a particular challenge. Raised without language and subjected to years of abuse, they required specialized care that didn't exist. 3 were adopted by religious families who believed they could heal them through prayer, only to abandon them when progress proved impossible. The others disappeared into the state orphanage system, their ultimate fates unknown. Dr. Morrison attempted to track them but was stonewalled by officials who considered the cases closed. The financial aftermath was equally frustrating. Despite evidence of massive embezzlement, most of the Brotherhood's funds were never recovered. Shell companies dissolved, bank accounts emptied, and property transfers were protected by legal technicalities. Victims' families received no compensation, while several of the accused retained their wealth and simply relocated to areas where their crimes were unknown. The medical establishment's reckoning was minimal. While a few professors lost their positions, most institutions closed ranks to protect their own. The American Medical Association issued a statement condemning extreme treatments, but took no action against members implicated in the conspiracy. Medical schools continued purchasing cadavers from questionable sources, and the use of asylum patients for experimentation continued, albeit more discreetly. Perhaps most disturbing was how quickly society moved to forget. Newspapers, initially eager for sensational details, soon found their editors encouraged to focus on other stories. The federal report on Briarwood, completed in 1872, was classified to prevent public panic and remained sealed. Local histories of Cedar Hollow omitted mention of the asylum entirely, and within a decade, newcomers to the area had no knowledge of what had occurred. Several critical questions remained unanswered. The original text that had inspired Whitmore, the Liber Silentium Sanctum, was never found. References in the investigation suggested copies existed in other Brotherhood facilities, but searches found nothing. The European connection was never fully investigated due to international jurisdictional issues. Most troubling, evidence suggested that several Brotherhood members had escaped before arrests were made, possibly fleeing to South America or Australia, where they could continue their work. U.S. Attorney Crawford, in his final report, wrote, "We have cut off the head of this serpent, but I fear the body lives on." The ideas that animated these crimes, that humanity can be improved through mutilation, that suffering purifies the soul, that authorities have the right to modify those under their power. These ideas persist. We have won a battle, but the war against such darkness continues. Dr. Morrison's efforts to publicize the case met with systematic suppression. His book on Briarwood was blocked from publication by legal threats. His medical practice was destroyed by rumors that he was obsessed with the macabre. He eventually relocated to California, where he spent his remaining years treating immigrants and writing letters to authorities about suspected Brotherhood activity, letters that were invariably ignored. The last official action related to Briarwood came in 1873 when the asylum was demolished. The state claimed it was structurally unsound, but workers reported that the demolition was rushed, with sections of the basement sealed rather than excavated. The land was sold to a logging company that clear-cut the area, erasing all traces of the institution. Today, a shopping center sits on the site, its customers unaware of the horrors that occurred beneath their feet. The Silent Brotherhood itself was never officially disbanded because it was never officially acknowledged to exist. Investigation files were sealed, witnesses were silenced through legal agreements or fear, and gradually the entire episode was relegated to rumor and legend. Occasional reports surfaced. A similar institution discovered in Oregon in 1889, strange medical procedures in a Kansas asylum in 1895. But these were treated as isolated incidents rather than part of a pattern. The Briarwood Asylum murders force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of institutional power and society's willingness to sacrifice its most vulnerable members on the altar of respectability. What happened in those Virginia hills wasn't an aberration. It was the logical extreme of beliefs that permeated 19th century America and persist in modified forms today. The asylum system of the 1800s operated on a fundamental premise that certain individuals had forfeited their right to autonomy through mental illness, poverty, or social deviance. Once labeled as mad, a person ceased to be fully human in the eyes of the law and society. This dehumanization created the perfect conditions for abuse. Whitmore didn't invent cruelty. He simply took it to its theological conclusion. If the insane were already viewed as less than human, why not remake them into something else entirely? What reveals itself through the Briarwood investigation is humanity's capacity to rationalize atrocity through ideology. Whitmore's journals show not a descent into madness, but a methodical construction of justification. Each surgery was preceded by a theological argument. Each death was framed as liberation. The Brotherhood didn't see themselves as murderers, but as pioneers, pushing the boundaries of human transformation. This ability to commit evil while believing oneself righteous is perhaps humanity's most dangerous trait. The complicity of educated, respectable individuals, doctors, judges, professors, demonstrates how professional expertise can become a shield for malevolence. These men used their credentials and social standing to place themselves beyond suspicion. They perverted the trust society placed in them, turning healing into harm, justice into oppression, education into experimentation. The very institutions meant to protect the vulnerable became the mechanisms of their destruction. Yet perhaps the most disturbing lesson from Briarwood is how easily society chose to forget. The horror was too great, the implications too threatening to the established order. Rather than confront the systemic failures that enabled such atrocities, authorities buried the evidence and silenced the survivors. The asylum was demolished, the record sealed, the story suppressed. This wasn't just about protecting the guilty. It was about protecting the myth of institutional benevolence that society required to function. The patterns we see at Briarwood echo through history in different forms. Whenever a population is deemed less than, whenever treatment is forced rather than consensual, whenever secrecy shrouds institutional practices, the potential for Briarwood-style abuse exists. The vocabulary changes. Treatment becomes therapy. Moral insanity becomes other diagnoses, but the underlying dynamic remains. Those with power over the powerless face constant temptation to abuse that authority, especially when they can frame that abuse as beneficial. Modern parallels exist, though we must be careful not to diminish Briarwood's unique horror through comparison. Contemporary instances of institutional abuse, medical experiments without consent, and the use of vulnerable populations for research all echo Briarwood's themes. The isolation that protected Whitmore has its modern equivalent in bureaucratic obscurity and legal complexity. Today's Brotherhood wouldn't need secret meetings. They could hide behind corporate structures and professional organizations. Why did this story remain hidden for 150 years? The answer lies in a combination of legal suppression, social shame, and active concealment. The court orders sealing the records were repeatedly renewed by judges who may have been Brotherhood members or simply officials who believed some truths were too dangerous to reveal. Families of victims often preferred silence to the shame of having a mad relative. Local communities that had enabled the horror through their indifference had no interest in preserving the memory of their complicity. The recent unsealing of these records came only through a technicality. The original court order had a 150-year maximum that no one expected to be reached. Even now, there are efforts to reseal the documents, to declare them historically irrelevant, or potentially harmful to public order. Certain medical institutions have filed injunctions to prevent their predecessors' involvement from being discussed. Some descendants of Brotherhood members have offered significant sums to acquire and destroy evidence of their ancestors' crimes. But these stories demand to be told, not for sensationalism, but as warnings. The victims of Briarwood were silenced twice, first by Whitmore's blade, then by society's willful amnesia. To forget them is to enable future Briarwoods, future Whitmores, future Brotherhoods. The price of preventing such horrors is eternal vigilance against those who would use authority, expertise, or ideology to deny others their humanity. The theological perversion at Briarwood's heart, the belief that suffering could create sanctity, that mutilation could produce purity, represents a recurring human temptation to play God with others' lives. Whitmore believed he could surgically create angels. His spiritual descendants might believe they can chemically create perfection, electronically create compliance, or genetically create improvement. The tools change. The hubris remains constant. What Briarwood ultimately reveals is that the greatest horrors don't come from obvious monsters, but from those convinced of their own righteousness. Whitmore died believing he was a prophet. The Brotherhood saw themselves as visionaries. The community that enabled them thought they were being charitable. Evil at its most dangerous comes wrapped in good intentions, professional credentials, and religious authority. So I ask you now, what do you think really happened to the missing Brotherhood members who were never found? Are their descendants still out there, carrying on Whitmore's work in modern forms we haven't yet recognized? Consider this. Several major psychiatric institutions in the Briarwood investigation. How many similar stories remain buried in sealed records, waiting for their 150-year marks to expire? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What disturbs you most about this case? The systematic mutilation, the network of complicity, or the fact that so many escaped justice? Have you heard of similar cases in your area that were covered up or forgotten? Sometimes our viewers' comments lead us to our next investigation. If you made it through this entire dark journey, you're truly one of our bravest viewers. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Next week, we're investigating the mysterious disappearances at the Magdalene Laundries of Ireland, where we'll discover that Briarwood's methods may have crossed the Atlantic in ways you won't believe. Thank you for bearing witness to the victims of Briarwood Asylum. In a world that wanted to forget them, you've chosen to remember. Together, we ensure that these dark chapters of history are never repeated. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, the most dangerous monsters are those who believe they're saints.